Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me thank Oded first for his kind introduction, but you wouldn't believe how much I had to pay him to say those things. I also, of course, want to pay tribute to the Tannenbaum Enrichment Fund, which has brought me here and sponsored so many lectures in this series, and to the Tam Institute for Jewish Studies. Oded's own books on daily life in ancient Israel, on agriculture and animal husbandry, are basic research tools for all of us. At 80, I don't go out quite as often as I do, but I wouldn't have missed this occasion for anything because I want to help honor Oded, and we shall do so all day tomorrow in a series of lectures. I do like long titles. When I wrote the book about ordinary people, my wife said to me, but you never met any ordinary people. You're an academic. But she says, I have, and some of them are interesting. So I wrote the book. Now, the title, Did God Have a Wife, will be unsettling, perhaps, to some of you, so I want to offer you some reassurance. Yes, he did have a wife, but he divorced her, so it's all right. She got everything, of course, and he got the Jewish people, which wasn't a great bargain. But tonight I want to talk about what I shall call folk religion, although others might call it family religion or household religion. Sometimes it's opposed to what might be called official religion or state religion, but that's a false dichotomy. It's not that simple. In any case, until recently, the Hebrew Bible was really the only source we had for reconstructing ancient Israelite beliefs and practices. But about 100 years ago, archaeology began to provide new information, and in the last 20 or 30 years, it has revolutionized our understanding of Israelite religion, at least in one fashion. Now, you might think the Hebrew Bible would be an adequate source. The book is all about religion, but it isn't a good source. It's limited, and you will understand if you think about it for a moment. The Bible was written, first of all, long after most events had transpired, in some cases centuries later. Not only that, it was written by a handful of elites attached to the court and the temple in Jerusalem. It was not representative of the majority of people. And it was written by men. Do you think if we had a women's Bible, it would make any difference? Oh, yes. Yes. And finally, the Bible is an idealistic picture of what Israelite belief and practice should have been like had these fellows been in charge, but they never were. The Bible is a minority report. After the committee had done its work, this minority report tries to reconstruct religion to suit the few who wrote the Bible. So keep that in mind. Now, archaeology provides us another window through which to look at Israelite beliefs and practices, a new tool for understanding ancient Israel. And as Oded said, recently I have argued that the Bible is now a secondary source. Don't be shocked. The Bible is limited. I'm going to say something so simple it sounds silly. You cannot wring out of the biblical text any more information than there is in them. That's why it's a secondary source. But archaeology is new every day. There are fabulous discoveries being made in Israel and even in Jordan today that will change everything. So I want to describe for you as a historian what most people were actually doing in the name of their religion. One of my colleagues has said the real religion of ancient Israel is almost everything the biblical writers condemned. That's it. That's it. Now, I'm not making a judgment as to which is preferable or which is legitimate. That's for you. Consult your rabbi or priest or pastor. I'm a historian. I only want to try to describe what it was actually like for most people most of the time in ancient Israel and Judah. I want to start in about the 10th century, the early monarchy, and go through the fall of Jerusalem around 586, moving also from north to south, and dealing with sites that I'm sure you are all familiar with. So hold on, this is going to be a rough ride. May we have the lights down? I don't need them. And I'm sure you will not be taking notes, so this will work. You are all familiar, of course, with many of the sites we will talk about, beginning all the way at Dan, up on the northern border with Syria and Lebanon, and extending all the way down into the Negev Desert and across, in fact, into the Sinai Desert. These are some of the sites, both named and unnamed, that we now know from the 13th, 12th century. These would represent our earliest Israelite sites. I want to begin a little bit later, when the state of Israel, and the state of Judah as well, emerged in the 10th century BCE. Let's start in the north at Tel Dan, right on the border. The site has been excavated for a long time by the late Avram Biran and partially reconstructed, and here you see something of what the city wall might have looked like around the 9th century BCE. As you approach the site, you come up through a triple entryway gate with a large plaza and then up through a cobbled street up to a second gate farther up, but there is a gate shrine in the area where you first enter the site. Now, at that point, you see a low stone platform, and behind it are 5 standing stones. Now, these are what the Hebrew Bible refers to as matzevot. A matzevah is a standing stone that commemorates the appearance of a deity. In early pre-Israelite religion, they were apparently acceptable, but by the time of the state and the monarchy, Israelite religion regards these as pagan, as Canaanite. Therefore, you're not supposed to have matzevot. They're always condemned. So what are they doing at Dan, which was one of the most important cities in the northern kingdom and almost the cultural capital in the 9th and 8th centuries? As you go farther up on the crest of the mound, you come to what is probably again a biblical installation. A bama is a high place, an elevated natural hillock or a platform on which there may be a structure where animal sacrifices and other rites are carried out. What's wrong with there being a bama at Dan? In fact, the book of Kings mentions a bama at Dan, and this may be the very one. That would not be a fantastic claim. So what's the problem? Here's what it probably looked like, perhaps not a temple foundation, but simply a larger-than-life standing altar. But again, these are associated with Canaanite rituals, so they're always condemned, at least in the later portions of the Hebrew Bible. Now, next to that building was a small tripartite building, which seems to be also a temple of sorts, and maybe the biblical lishka, a kind of shrine adjoining the temple in Jerusalem. And notice it is, like the Jerusalem temple, a tripartite building. Notice the altar there, and here you see it together with a broken store jar into which the ashes of animal sacrifices were swept away. And even there were found iron shovels. Now, these shovels, the altars, the animal sacrifices, all of this is described in the Hebrew Bible. Here is the problem. According to the Deuteronomistic historians, those who wrote or edited the books of Deuteronomy, plus Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, there is only one legitimate sanctuary, the temple in Jerusalem, under the aegis of the royal priest. So these popular local cults are always condemned, and priests and prophets and reformers, especially kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, tried to stamp out the local cults. So already you see what I'm getting at, the disconnect between the biblical description of religion, which was legitimate, and the actual religious practices, the disconnect. Now here is part of a large horned altar. By the way, we use meters, so that's 30 centimeters, about a foot or so. So this is a very large installation, which has now been reconstructed. The only other one ever found like it is at Beersheba in the south. And in the Bible, the borders of Israel are from Dan to Beersheba. Now the problem is, the altars we find for the most part are very small affairs, little things like this. According to the Bible, you could flee to the cities of refuge and cling to the horns of a big altar like this and nobody could drag you away. If you were holding on to one of the little fellows, they would carry you and the altar off. So the altars that we actually have don't fit the biblical description very well. And here you see one of the smaller ones, badly damaged, found at Dan. These are the typical ones, probably incense sulfur for incense offerings. Now, this installation was also found at Dan. First, it was thought to have something to do with water libations, but we now know it's part of an olive pressing installation. There you see the stone on which the baskets of olives were placed and the weights for the beams that bore down on them, and then the collection basin here. Now, why would you have an olive pressing installation in the temple precinct? Because you're using, cold-pressed virgin olive oil for liturgical purposes. So we have priestly rites being carried out here at Dan rather than in Jerusalem. Here you see also a bronze scepter found at the site, probably carried by priests, local priests, and there was a bronze working installation found, all within the temple precinct. So here we have a full-fledged temple almost under the noses of the writers of the biblical. This was everything they were opposed to. But here it is at a major Israelite site. Now, certainly according to the first and second commandments, there is only one deity, a male deity, and you are not to make any representations whatsoever of him. So we should not find male or female figurines. Well, here we have two at Dan, a male and a female, very Phoenician in style. And this reminds us that according to the writers of the Bible, Dan was a Phoenician site. It was pagan. It was foreign. The biblical writers don't have a single good thing to say about a single king in the north. They're all bad. They're all bad. And everything they did was bad. But that's the reality. In northern Israel, there were these cults, both male and female figurines attesting them. Now let's turn to a second site on the southern reaches of the Jezreel Valley, the site of Tanakh, a sister city of Megiddo. And there both the German and American excavators found what I would call a village shrine, probably serving several households. And here we are dealing with household and family cults. There were several things found here, installations for preparing and cooking food. And among the other things, there was found a bowl of polished astragali, sheep or goat knuckles. What would these bones be for? Casting lots, doing magic, which is all right, but only if the priests are doing it. Shouldn't be doing it here, not here of all places. But among the other things, there was found another olive press, a pressing installation, all within the confines of a village shrine serving a few families. Now, this stand was found long ago by the Germans, and another one was also found. It's a terracotta stand about 3 feet tall. It's the most remarkable piece of Israelite art ever found. Now remember, there shouldn't be any Israelite art. If you can't represent humans or animals or anything else from nature, there really can't be any art. But this is art of a sort, and it is Israelite. I won't deal with the upper registers. It's an offering stand. There was probably a bowl on top, and you could offer food or drink offerings. You could burn incense in the bottom part. I want to direct your attention away from all those strange scenes to the one at the bottom. Who is she? Well, if memory serves me correctly, this is a female. And she's quite nude, except for a big smile. And she's holding 2 lions by the ears. Now, we find this amusing, but it means something. It's clearly Israelite, and it belongs to the 10th century, the very age of Solomon and the temple in Jerusalem. I have argued that she is Asherah, the lion lady, as she is known in many texts. She is the old Canaanite mother goddess who was still venerated, I will argue, in ancient Israel. So keep Asherah in mind. I'm very fond of her. I wrote this book about her, and she's been very good to me recently. I always say when my wife goes to temple, did you see Asherah? And she says, yes. And I said, did she ask about me? No. Well, I wrote a book about her, and she doesn't ask about me. Well, our whole family is fond of her, and many other people were in ancient Israel too, so I think this is the great lady. Now, the most important find, however, from this shrine may be a mold for making these female figurines. Now, we shouldn't have them at all, but we have hundreds of them, and in fact, if we take all kinds together, we might have 2,000 or 3,000 of them. They are so common everywhere from the 10th to the 6th century that probably every household had them. So the question is, what are they? An earlier generation saw them as toys. This is sort of the Barbie doll syndrome, but these are not toys. These work. Be careful. So others think that these are votive offerings. They represent human females. Others think that they represent the goddess herself, and I take that view. Not everyone agrees, but I think the opinion is growing. In any case, they have something to do with a female, probably a goddess, or her worship, and I connect them with the goddess Asherah, as most scholars do, in one way or another. Now notice it's a mold, so these things were mass-produced. It's like buying candles in a church. You could go and for a shekel, you could buy one and take it home. This is the only real mold we have found, but they must have been mass-produced. Now notice, at her breast, she's holding a round object. Now that's sometimes thought to be a tambourine, but one of my students did his dissertation on ancient Israelite music, and you don't play tambourines that way. It might be a frame drum. I think it's a cake, a mold-made cake, and I remind you that in the book of Ezekiel, there's a fabulous denunciation of popular religion, and the prophet says, why, it's so bad that the children gather sticks for kindling, and the men build fires, and the women bake cakes for the Queen of Heaven. Who is the Queen of Heaven? And what are Israelite and Judean women doing baking cakes for her? So I take this to be a mold-made bread cake, although not everyone agrees. Now, many years ago, a series of bronze arrowheads were found at El Hadr near Bethlehem, outside of Jerusalem, dating from the 12th, 11th century, the period of the Judges, And they read in a very ancient script. This is a particular arrow, and it says on the one side, Abdulabit, the servant of the lioness, or the lion lady. So he's a professional archer, and the goddess, whose name is Asherah, is his patron. On the other side is his name, Ben Anat. Now, in Canaanite religion preceding Israel, in the land of Canaan, there are three major female deities, Anat, Asherah, and Astarte. Only Asherah survives in any great detail in the Hebrew Bible, but we have here the other name of Anat. So clearly, the lion lady is associated in some way with cult. Now, the third site I want to talk about is Tel El Farah, now in the West Bank and the territories, which was the first capital of the northern kingdom before Samaria in the 9th century. Once again, we have here a double entryway gate, and as you come in, there's another shrine. And notice the matzevah, the standing stone, about 10 feet tall. And notice the basin, again, perhaps having something to do. Now, why these gate shrines? Travel was dangerous in antiquity, and when you went out of the safety of the city, you prayed for a fortunate journey, and when you came back, you were glad to be alive. At Kennedy Airport in New York, there are 3 chapels where you can pray on your way to the Middle East, and I suggest you visit all 3. Can't hurt when you go, as I'm going next month. So these gate shrines turn out to be very important, but they're only vaguely alluded to in the Hebrew Bible, and yet they were probably quite numerous. Now, among the finds of the French excavators of Tel El Farah were these figurines, and in the center at the top, you see again the female with the object we've been discussing at her breast. Here she's dressed, at least the lower body. She's bare from the waist up. Look at number 3 on the right, and she is quite nude. Some scholars have simply called her the naked goddess. I prefer to name her as Asherah. Notice at the bottom you have other representations of a pregnant woman or a woman nursing. Now, earlier scholars call all of this kind of popular religion or folk religion fertility religion. These were fertility cults. They had to do with reproduction. So let's keep that in mind as we proceed to ask who she is. Now, also found at Tel Farah, and again from the age of Solomon, is what we call a naos, or a model temple, terracotta model, about a foot tall. In some cases, you have a deity or a pair of deities in the doorway of the temple, but here the temple is vacant. Now, I want you to notice on both sides, the columns are in the form of trees, palm trees in this case. The volutes are upside down. You don't have palm trees here much, but Tucson, we have a lot of palm trees, and so do we have in Cyprus. So these are clearly trees, as many scholars have recognized. Now, if you look between the trees, you see what, and you'll have to take my word for it, is a crescent, a moon crescent, which is also a symbol of the goddess, and the stars may be connected with the stars of Pleiades. These are all astral symbols that are connected with deities, both male and female. So these are model shrines. And certainly we would not expect to find them at Israelite sites, but we do. Here is one from Idalian, the site my wife is excavating. We live just a couple of miles away. And here we see a complete model from about the 6th century. And notice again the trees as columns. Now here, if you look in the doorway, you see the goddess, a nude female. And look around the side at the window. In case you missed her there, she's looking out the window. And if you go around the back, she's there too. It's a slow Friday evening, and she's drumming up a little business. Come to my house, come see me. The word bet in most Semitic languages means not only house, but it also means temple. So the temple is the house of the gods. The gods are at home, both male and female, even in the Israelite and Judean cult. Here is one from Transjordan, and once again you see the palm trees with double volutes, and then look at the dove. Now, in later Phoenician cults, the dove is a symbol of Tanit, who is another version, as it were, of the goddess Asherah. So the old mother goddess has been around for a very long time in the Levant and persists until very late times. Sometimes she has been driven underground and almost forgotten, but archaeology has resurrected her. Here is one that is not very well published from Transjordan, and once again you see not only the trees, the columns, and of course the birds at the top, but look at the bottom. There are 2 lions. So we have a lot of imagery and a lot of text, in fact, identifying Asherah, the old Canaanite mother goddess, as the lion lady. So keep in mind the lions. Here is one, Phoenician, and here we have either a priestess or a female deity at home in her house. And notice the very stylized columns here, which are almost like the antecedents of later Aeolic columns, and again the winged sun disk over the doorway. So all of this imagery is strange. Here is one also from Cyprus, and wherever you see figures like this with a kind of bouffant wig, that is the Egyptian cow goddess Hathor, who is connected with Asherah. And in case you missed the point, she is wearing as a hat a naos, and there is the other representation of the lady in the doorway on the hat. So this one, over here on the wall, right here. Thank you. There she is, you see. So there is Asherah in the guise of Hathor, an Egyptian goddess, and she has her temple carrying it around on her head as a hat. Remarkable that you have it here. There are many versions of this, especially from Cyprus in the Phoenician world. Now, many years ago, I used to visit the tomb in the garden of the French school, the École Biblique, and in the bench tombs there, I noticed these peculiar headrests, and this is obviously, again, the Hathor wig. Now, here's my point. Previously, we thought that, folk religion was primitive and it was exercised out in the countryside, but not in Jerusalem, the spiritual capital. But the point is here, 100 yards from the temple, a Judean woman could be buried for eternity with her head in the wig of the goddess. So something clearly is going on that doesn't fit the biblical descriptions of monotheism. Now, let's look at the only other full-fledged temple we have ever found at Arad in the south, east of Beersheba. Excavated by Israeli archaeologists, never, however, fully published. Here is a plan of the building, and it's, again, a tripartite building. The outer room is the large courtyard with the altar, and then you come into a broad room with benches where offerings would have been made, and then finally, at H, you have the Holy of Holies, the little inner sanctum, the Dever. Now, my name, Dever, in Israel, unfortunately, is pronounced Dever, which means plague or pestilence. So I don't like it. I add a yud and change it to Dever, Professor Holy of Holies. In any case, this is startling because it's built on the same tripart arrangement as the temple in Jerusalem. When it was first found, archaeologists were reluctant to admit that it was a temple, and then they were reluctant to admit that it was Israelite. However, this is precisely, I think, the kind of local temple that reformers like Hezekiah and Josiah tried to destroy. Now, here is where I want to tell you something that will help you. What I'm describing for you sounds rather strange. Were people actually doing this? The point is, the biblical writers would not have gone to such great lengths to condemn all of this if it hadn't been very popular. So they give themselves away in talking about their ideal religion. They can't help dealing with the reality. So this shouldn't be really so surprising. It's not revolutionary. If we had read between the lines in the Hebrew Bible, we would have known this long ago. Now, here in the outer court of the temple at Arad is a large altar reconstructed here. It's built like the biblical description of an altar. It's built without hewn stones. So that fits, but other things don't fit. Now, at the base of the altar was found a bronze lion, not a very large one, it's actually a small weight, but keep in mind the connection we've already made between the lion or lioness and Asherah. Now, here is one of the offering stands that were found, and these consisted usually of two parts. You could use them for food or drink offerings or for libation offerings, various kinds of things. And again, the Hebrew Bible describes these offerings. But as far as I can tell, the Hebrew terms for these kinds of offering vessels do not fit the ones we have. So here is another one of these disconnects. Now, among the texts found were ostraca mentioning a temple, a house of Yahweh. I don't think it's the Jerusalem temple. I think it's the temple at Arad. And there are priestly families mentioned who are reminiscent of families we know. But the whole point is there shouldn't have been any such temple, full functioning temple with its own priesthood, if the biblical writers had had their way, but they didn't. Now, in the inner sanctum of the temple, we have long since noticed that you have two stylized horned altars at the end, which have some remains of a kind of organic substance, perhaps for incense. And then, of course, you have in the inner sanctum a standing stone, a matzevah, representing a deity, but you can count as well as I can, and there are two. And the one is shorter than the other. In fact, there were three originally. But they were found carefully laid down and buried under the plaster surface. Some have suggested this is evidence of the reforms either of Hezekiah or perhaps Josiah. It is said specifically they abolished the local sanctuaries and tore down the Matzevot. I'm not sure we can go that far, but it is interesting that here in this temple we have what appear to be a pair of deities. I don't know who suggested that first, but I think most people now will see it that way. I'm stuck. It won't go forward. There it is. Sometimes when this happens, I think somebody is trying to tell me something, but usually we recover. I want to go back one. All right. Now, this belongs to the late Bronze Age and is found in the temple at Lachish in the southern Judean hills. But I want to point out that here we see the goddess in her Egyptian guise with an Egyptian headdress and holding lotus blossoms. And here she's associated not with a lion or lioness, but with a war horse, an armored horse. So she's associated with various things, not just lions and lionesses. Now, this was found a long time ago. It's a Canaanite inscription on a large store jar and mentions Elat. So you have a male deity named El in Canaan and a female deity named Elat. And in the Hebrew Bible, you have the name El as one of the names of the deity, but you have it in the plural. So what is the name of God doing in the plural, and why does he have two names? Now, Ruth Hestron, late of the Israel Museum, a wonderful woman, years ago came up with a novel idea that few people would agree with in the beginning. I remember when she first told me about it, I didn't think it was serious either. She looked back at some Canaanite pendants from the Bronze Age before 1200 and discovered these in electrum and in silver, and noticed the one on the right and then the drawings. In every case, we have the bouffant headdress, so this must be Hathor, or Asherah, as she was later known. And notice that she is not only nude, she has neither arms nor legs, but the breasts are prominently displayed. But it is not the breast that attracted Ruth's attention. She looked at the lower body, and she noticed something I don't think anybody else had ever noticed. There you have the pubic triangle, and growing out of the vulva is a tree. At the risk of being indelicate, this is not pubic hair. It's not the dark line you may see on the belly of a pregnant woman. It is a tree. Now, when I was lecturing recently and talking about the triangle, the pubic triangle as a symbol of the goddess, somebody in the audience said, "Oh, that's all over the place, that symbol." What? And the woman said, "Oh, it's all along the road, and it means yield." Right on, lady. Right on. I yield. Well, so that's what Ruth argued. Then she went a little further, and she reminded us of a drawing from the tomb of none other than a son of Thutmose III, an Egyptian pharaoh, and you notice that the tree has a breast and is nourishing the Egyptian prince. So the mother, the lactating mother in the tree, these are all bound up. So she is also a tree goddess. Now, what's wrong with trees? But remember the condemnation of Israelite folk religion or popular religion. On every high hill and under every green tree, they fornicate themselves. They worship pagan. What's wrong with trees? The tree is associated with Asherah. Now, the term Asherah occurs in the Hebrew Bible about 40 times. And mostly it looks like a tree because it's something bad. And when you see an Asherah, it's Canaanite. You should cut it down and chop it up and burn it. The verbs are associated. But in at least 5 or 6 cases, Asherah is a personal name, Baal and Asherah. If Baal is a deity, so is Asherah. So the point is the word could refer either to the goddess, the great goddess herself, or to her symbol, a living tree or a wooden pole. But it was all bad. It was all anathema to the writers of the Israelite tradition because it was Canaanite. And here is another painting, and now today we could cite more than 20 of these, showing a tree as a nurturing mother. Keep that connection in mind. Now, years ago, I was driving all the way from Jerusalem to Baghdad when there were no roads, and the farther out in the desert in Syria I got, I noticed there were fewer and fewer trees. And finally, there was only this tree. And I drove up to it, and it was festooned with little bits of paper and little pieces of women's clothing, little prayers written in Arabic to the tree goddess, the tree goddess. Now, if you come with me to Cyprus, where we live much of the year, I can take you to Byzantine Greek Orthodox churches, and there's always an old tree, centuries-old tree in the courtyard. And again, you see the prayers for good fortune attached to the tree. So the tree symbolism remains vital in an arid part of the world. In Tucson, we worship trees too, because we don't have many. So keep in mind the tree connection. I want to go quickly to a site we'll discuss more tomorrow, the site of Kuntilat Ajrud, in the Sinai Desert, excavated by the Israelis in 1978, 100 years after it was first found, and here you see it on the map. It is back in Egyptian hands now. This is an 8th century fort combined with an inn and a shrine, I think, which is actually very remarkable as an illustration of popular religion or folk religion. Here is the site itself, a hilltop shrine, quite isolated along the old caravan routes. Here is the plan of the major building, and you see it's a courtyard fortress with double walls and corner towers, rather like many of the other Negev Sinai fortresses. But at the entrance, where you see the offset gate, we have a series of plastered rooms and inscriptions which are indeed remarkable. The site is very isolated, visited perhaps only by a few Bedouin today, but in antiquity it may have been a major stopover for caravans crossing this area. For a long time, these inscriptions were not well published. I looked at them in the late 70s with Zev Meshel, and when I first began to read the Hebrew inscriptions, I could hardly believe my mind. It was published fully only last year. For a long time, it was almost too hot to handle. These are typical 8th century graffiti, essentially, in Hebrew. This one, we now have the rest of it, but it has something to do with a prayer for good fortune. So again, traveling through the desert, you would pray for a safe journey, whether you were a trader or a pilgrim or whatever you were doing. So these plaster inscriptions turn out to be very important. Well, among the various offerings here, what was this large bowl, an enormously heavy thing, but a votive offering. And again, it's inscribed in good classical biblical Hebrew. The names are also biblical. Belonging to Abdio ben Adnah, blessed he be, may he be by Yahweh. Notice Yahweh, the name of the Hebrew, the Israelite God. So there is no question that this is Israelite. The pottery is both Israelite and Judean and suggests a mixture of elements coming from both north and south. So these inscriptions are mostly of a religious nature, which is not surprising. I'm sorry to be delayed. It doesn't like me. All right. Now, among the paintings on the large store jars are some remarkable scenes. Now, remember, there shouldn't be any Israelite art. It's prohibited. Keep in mind the way the cow is licking the tail of the calf, the way the calf is suckling. This is a traditional scene, but it's a Canaanite scene, and we know it very well from many ivories. Here's one from the 9th century, a century or so earlier, from Syria probably, showing the very same scene. So this is folk art, but it's drawing on old Canaanite motifs because there are few native Israelite traditions to use. Here is another painting from a jar, and notice, of course, the stylized tree. This is a very Canaanite scene with two rampant animals, probably wild goats, eating at the tree. And then at the bottom you have, I think, well, not a pussycat, but a lion. So again, the lion imagery is reminiscent. Now here's one of the strangest scenes of all in a large jar. It's not complete, so we're not quite sure what's going on. There's nothing like it anywhere else. And it shows a procession of people, perhaps worshipers with their hands extending with a gift, or perhaps raised in prayer. And it looks like, from the way their hair is standing on end, the service is electrifying. But what is going on? There's just nothing to compare this with. Now, this is the scene that has attracted the most attention. And I show you both the jar itself and the drawing, although today the drawing has been corrected a little bit. Look first of all at the drawing. There are two strange characters. These represent, no doubt, the Egyptian god Bes, who is the god of good luck, of good fortune, of rejoicing and celebrating, a god very common in both Egypt and Judah. And notice that one of the figures, the one on the left, seems to be male, to judge from the appendage. The one on the right, however, has breasts and also an appendage. But that's not really a problem. Bes wears a lion skin or a leopard skin, so maybe this is the tail, although we now have corrected the drawing. And Bes is both male and female, goes both ways. So some have argued that this is actually Yahweh and Asherah, the male and the female deity. I don't see it quite that way. I want to look at the seated woman at the right. Notice her carefully. Now I want to look at some parallels quickly. This is an ivory from Megiddo, about 1200 BC, a Canaanite ivory showing a king seated on a lion throne. The throne is actually a chair carried on the back of two lions. You see the claw feet at the bottom, and then you see the wings, the stylized wings, and look at the long tail curving up at the back, and then look, his feet are on a footstool. So what I want to suggest is the lion throne in the ancient world is occupied only by royalty or divinity. Ordinary people don't sit on such lion thrones. Here is an older one on the left showing Baal, or more likely El, the great Canaanite male deity, seated on a very stylized lion throne. Look, you can hardly make out the feathers of the wings. The stool is clear, and so are the claw feet, and so is the tail. The one on the right is in the Louvre Museum, the sarcophagus of King Ahiram, a 10th century king, and he's also seated on such a throne. And then these two pendants come from Ugarit, a Canaanite port site in Syria today. And here you see from perhaps the 14th or 13th century, especially at the right, a female with a polka-dotted dress sitting on a very stylized lion throne. Now let's go back to our scene. Do you see what I see? Look at the seated figure. Look at the clubby feet. Look at the panels, the feathers of the wings on the side. And look, the tail, the back of the chair is curved a little bit. But look, it's folk art. The artist forgot the stool, so the person's feet are dangling. Now it is a female, to judge from the breast, wearing a long skirt, and playing what may be a lyre. So the question is, who is this female? I have argued from the beginning, from the middle 1980s, that she represents Asherah. Not everybody agrees. Now look at the inscription at the right, and I want to read just the bottom line. It's an inscription about blessings, like many of these, and essentially the bottom line reads, "May X be blessed by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah." Who's Asherah? Yahweh's Asherah. And who is Asherah? I think we know. Now, of course, some people say, well, the two were written by two different hands. But the point is, whoever saw one saw the other. So there was nothing incongruous in the minds of whoever drew these pictures and made these graffiti. So I think in these inscriptions we have several gods. We have El, we have Yahweh, we have Baal, and we have Asherah. So the argument is that in classical Hebrew you wouldn't have a possessive suffix with a personal name, but there are exceptions. So more and more scholars are coming to regard this as not some half-nude Jewish housewife, not some queen mother or queen, but rather the goddess. And the inscription is speaking about Asherah, however you interpret it. Now here's the site of Beersheba in the site, and I want to just show you quickly a few things from there. Here is the horned altar we saw larger than life. It was found dismantled, so somebody is tampering with these expressions of folk religion or family religion. Now we come to the most important archaeological site ever excavated in Israel or the territories, mine. This is my site of Khirbet el-Kolm in the Hebron Hills, west of Hebron, about 12 miles, where we stopped tomb robbers right after the 67 war, and here's a picture of the cemetery being robbed. Among the other things, we cleared several tombs, like this one, bench tombs typical of the 8th century BCE, in Judah especially. And here is an inscription that I recovered. I was out in the field one day as it was about to rain in October, drawing a tomb, and a man came along with a stone under his arm and squatted down, a villager, and he smoked a cigarette and looked off in the distance. And finally he said, "Do you ever buy inscriptions?" Well, I had hardly ever seen one because they're very rare. And I said, "Sure, all the time," because I knew the price would go up. So finally I said, how much do you charge for inscriptions? He said, "Well, 2 dinars, it's about $6. And I said, "Okay, 2 dinars, tayyib, it's good, I'll take it." So I bought the stone, didn't express any interest, took it back to the dig house and dusted it off and began to read it, and I nearly fell over. Dates from the 8th century, and it reads more or less at the top, "Belonging to Uriyahu the governor, this is his inscription." And then the second line is like out of the Bible, "Baruch Uriyahu leYahweh." May Uriyahu the governor be blessed by Yahweh. So this is standard biblical Hebrew, well dated. But if you read lines 2 and 3 together, here's the way it goes. May Uriyahu be blessed by blessed by Yahweh and saved from his enemies by his Asherah. Exactly the same wording we have in the contemporary inscription we just looked at from Kuntilat Ajrud. So now we have two 8th century inscriptions speaking about Yahweh and his Asherah. Now the minimalist reading would be, may X be blessed by Yahweh in his tree. It doesn't make much sense to me. But may he be blessed by Yahweh and Asherah, his lady, makes a lot of sense to me. So that's the way I read it, though obviously not everybody agrees. Now we come to Jerusalem, which would be, you would think, the heart of Israelite religion, but I want to say something that will surprise you. Most people in ancient Israel had never been to Jerusalem. They certainly had never been in the temple in Jerusalem, which was a royal chapel and could be visited mostly by the priests and high priests. It was a long and difficult and dangerous mission. And remember that if most people had had the Bible, they couldn't have read it anyway because they were illiterate. As far as we know, perhaps only 1 or 2% of the population was literate. The Bible wasn't yet finished anyway. So I want to suggest to you that the whole theology of the Hebrew Bible would have been foreign to most people. They didn't know about it, they couldn't read, and it didn't make any difference. The temple was of no importance. They probably never met a real priest. It was all about surviving in the agricultural villages where they lived. It was about life or death. Here is one notion of what the temple may have looked like, but in fact nothing survives of the temple, nor will we ever be able to excavate the Temple Mount. The only surviving relic of the temple may be this tiny little ivory pomegranate, not much bigger than your thumb. However, the most recent studies suggest while the pomegranate is original and genuine, the inscription is perhaps added later. It may be a forgery. But what it says is interesting. It says something about set aside or consecrated for the priest for the temple of, and the name of the deity is missing. For years it was on display at the Israel Museum. It was purchased. Most people are now very suspicious. So let's forget about the temple. It was not central to Israelite popular religion as I'm describing it anyway. Next, please. Here, found by Kenyon, Dame Kathleen Kenyon in Jerusalem under the shadow of the Temple Mount, were these figurines. And again, you see the ones with the large discs. And then notice at the bottom, the rather simpler ones. Sometimes the lower ones are called Judean pillar-based figurines because they're found mostly in Judah and mostly in the 8th, 7th century. And the whole bottom looks like a pillar or like a tree trunk. The lower body is not represented. Only the breasts are prominent. That seems to be, as it were, the point of what you're supposed to see here. Next. Now, just to close with some cult paraphernalia, here are the horned altars we've talked about, which cannot be connected easily with the biblical descriptions, probably used for incense, which shouldn't have been offered anywhere but the temple anyway. Next. Here are some of the other offering stands we've talked about. They are very Canaanite in style, but common at most Israelite and Judean sites throughout the Iron Age. Next. Here is one of the strangest aspects of Israelite art we've ever found. From the site of Ai, north of Jerusalem, an Israelite site in the 12th, 11th century. It's a very large incense altar again, with preparations for a bowl on top and windows from which the smoke could waft. But look at the bottom. You see a row of feet. Now, most scholars have not commented on this. In my mind, you could represent the great lady, but it was too much to represent the male deity. You just didn't go that far. So you couldn't show his face, but you could show his feet. He's here. See? He's here. Remember the story when Moses wanted to see God's face, and he said, no, I'll walk and you can see my behind, but you can't see my face. So maybe you could see his feet, but that's all you could see. But they didn't hesitate to portray the female deity. Next. Here are some of the other kinds of cult items we find. At the top right is a rattle, which I think is not a toy, but probably was used in musical ceremonies. The bottom right vessel is called a kernos. It's a trick vessel. You can pour oil or wine into the bowl and manipulate it this way, and then when you tilt it out, it pours. Now again, libation often are described in the Bible, but these vessels never are. Next. Here is one from Galilee, and it has the pomegranate, a fertility symbol. These are both Canaanite and Israelite. Never mentioned as far as I can tell in the Hebrew Bible. Never. Next. We have horse figurines and various kinds of animal figurines. These would all have been prohibited, but we have them. Next. Here is a chariot, a model chariot from Canaanite times. In the Bible, Yahweh is sometimes described as riding across the sky in his chariot. So the imagery of many of the biblical stories is basically Canaanite. Next. Now I want to speak in closing about the figurines. Here are some from Jerusalem and elsewhere in Judah, the Judean pillar-based figurines. The more elaborate ones have a mold-made head, separately made and attached. The simpler ones just have a kind of pinched face. Now these have been the subject of a great deal of discussion, as I've suggested. Tomorrow we will discuss them further. I believe that they really are representations of the great goddess. I think they were probably used by women to conceive and to bear and to nurse a child, which was very dangerous and difficult in antiquity. I wouldn't use the word fertility cults, but perhaps we're talking about the notion of plenty and of sustenance that the gods prepared. Next. Here is a Phoenician one from Achziv on the coast, and notice here she's playing a frame drum, to be sure. These are different from the Judean ones. Next. Here again are Phoenician examples, and here you have the pregnant woman, sometimes nursing the child. These may well be votives. They may be representations of humans, but I think the Judean ones are probably representations of the goddess. Next. Now we also know that Asherah was worshipped in Phoenicia, and here is an inscription from Tel Mikne, biblical Ekron, and it says in a Phoenician script, for Asherat, the Phoenician form. And we have another one that says for the sanctuary of Asherat. So we have textual evidence not only for Judah, but also for Philistia of the veneration of the goddess Asherah, the old Canaanite goddess. Next. Here from Tel Batash, which is probably a Philistine site, later perhaps Judean, we have molds for making Philistine representations of the goddess. Next. And I want to point out these plaques which I photographed years ago in the Harvard Semitic Museum. Now I want you to notice the one at the top. I don't have to tell you what you're supposed to see. This is all about the pubic, this is in your face. You can't miss this one. This is what it's about. The symbol of the unique magical power of women to create life. And religion is about life and the sustenance of life. So these are the Canaanite examples. Now, next. Here is the great goddess too from Syria in her Canaanite guise, and once again the sexuality is obvious. One of my women friends, a biblical scholar, says in Canaan the goddess is the whore of the gods. But in Israel and Judah, I think she's the patroness of nursing mothers. Vast difference, vast difference. Next. Here we have a plaque, lost now in the Winchester Museum in Britain, and it gives the three names of the goddess. Kudshu is the Egyptian name for Asherah, and then you have the others, Anat and Astarte, and there she is. So that's the great goddess, or perhaps three of the goddesses combined, and notice she's riding on a lion. So again, the lion imagery is there throughout the whole period. Next. Now back to our figurines. You see what I mean about modesty. The Israelite and Judean ones are really all about a nursing mother. Next. Here is one from Jerusalem itself, not from the boondocks, but from Jerusalem itself, published by Avigad. And again, you can't miss the symbolism of the nurse. She is offering her breasts. And I don't think it's a woman offering her breast to the goddess. I think it's the other way around. The goddess is offering her nurturing breasts. So sometimes it is said these figurines have no symbolism, no iconography. Well, I don't know about the women in the audience, but the men all know about the symbolism of the breast, right? It's a powerful symbol, a powerful symbol. And I think it was in antiquity. You see, we think breasts are toys. In the ancient world, they were taken as matters of life. If a woman could not nurse a child, she would undoubtedly lose the child. And more often, most children died in infancy. Next. Well, of course, the great male deities are well known. Here are the Canaanite versions of El standing and, or seating, being seated, and Baal, and these gods are remembered in the Hebrew Bible, and so are at least one female deity. Next. Here is a gold plaque from the coast of Syria, from the Canaanite era, showing again the goddess on her lion at the bottom. Next. And of course, the mother goddess goes all the way back to Neolithic times and even earlier times. Some of the oldest figurines we have from the Stone Age are of the great goddess. Don't worry about her. She's going to Weight Watchers next week. But there she is, magnificent. Next. Here is a plaque now in the Rome Museum which shows the goddess Aphrodite arising from the froth of the waves off the coast of Cyprus near Paphos. In later legend, Aphrodite is connected, of course, with Ashur. And who is Aphrodite but the goddess of sex and beauty and love and procreation? So the gods are not forgotten. These Canaanite gods were borrowed by the Israelites and by the Phoenicians and by the Greeks and by the Romans, and they are still venerated in some senses even today. So, by the way, at Paphos now, if you go there in the summertime, you can see Aphrodite. There are lots of Aphrodites. It's a topless beach, and the Swedish women are there in the summertime, and the beach is full of Aphrodites. So she's alive and well. Next. Here's the famous Mexican artist, Frida Kahlo's painting, My Nurse and I. I want to end by suggesting that the notion of mother and of motherhood is as fundamental, as timeless, as universal as any notion that humans have ever conceived. I have only to say mother, and a wealth of meaning comes to mind. Now, the men who wrote the Bible created God in their own male image. The imagery is male, the language is male, but why should it be? If God can be the father, why not the mother? Now, there are some hints of that already in the Hebrew Bible. In the creation story, it says, and let us, it's plural, make humans in our image. Who's us? And so humans were created in the image of God, male and female. I suggest that already, even among the writers of the Bible, orthodox as they were, there was a notion of the Great Mother. She had not been quite forgotten. When my daughter Hannah, who is now 30, was 5, we were discussing theology one day, as she was fond of doing, and she said, Abba, did you know that God is a woman? And I thought, well, I'll learn something here. So I said, well, yes, sweetie, your mother and I write a lot about that. And I said, why should that be so? And she said, silly, because half the people in the world are women, and God has to be for everybody. Bingo. Thank you.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.